Rabbi,
Yeah, David.
there was one thing I was confused about yesterday. You were talking about the procedure when a Kohen's taking a bird for a sacrifice, and he nips the neck.
Yeah, Maluka.
And we said that wasn't considered shechting, so an Israelite could not eat it.
It is for a korban, but it's not for food, for regular food. But it is for a korban. It has to be done that way as a korban.
Okay, but when you say it's not for food, so nobody eats from it. It's like an ola.
No, what I meant was outside of a korban, it is not a proper way to shecht it. It is proper to shecht it as a korban. So if there was such a thing as a bird offering that is eaten, then you would eat it because it's an offering, it's a korban. So for korban, it is sufficient. But outside the Beis Hamikdash, for any other reason, he's saying you can't do it.
But a regular Israelite can never do it, either inside or.
Well, I don't know, because there's two birds that are brought for I'm pretty sure that none of them are ever a shlamim, but am I positive about that? No.
Well, yeah, I guess does the Kohen ever eat the bird?
Right. I feel like there is a situation where they do, because sin offerings, the Kohanim eat sin offerings, and there are birds that are brought, like when the woman brings her birds, one of them is a sin offering. So I'm quite certain that Kohanim do, but I don't know if there's a situation where a non-Kohen would. Are there any bird offerings that yeah, so I'm assuming that the sin offering ones are eaten by Kohanim, because Kohanim tend to eat sin offerings.
Okay.
Just one more thing here. Any bird offerings? So the quick answer on perplexity is there are no bird offerings that are shlamim. So I'm assuming that it would only be Kohanim who would eat it, but it would be permitted to eat because it's a sacrifice that was it was a bird offering, and that's how you kill them. But otherwise, for food, you would not. I remember last time I said that I wanted to check about why we don't have Nikur let's just see here. Okay. Misconception. This is from September 13th, 2006. Misconception. Nikur Achoraim, rendering the hindquarters of an animal fit for kosher consumption, is a Sephardic practice that is banned by rabbinic fiat for Ashkenazim and thus not performed in the United States. Fact, there is no such ban, and Nikur was practiced in many Ashkenazic communities in the 20th century. The practice of some communities to refrain from eating hindquarters owing to the difficulty in excising the forbidden sections continues to exist amongst both Ashkenazim and Sephardim. After a kosher animal is properly slaughtered and inspected, it still may not be consumed until certain large blood vessels, chaylev, prohibited fats known as tallow or suet, and the gid hanosha, the sciatic nerve, are removed. The removal process is called nikur, or trabering in Yiddish, porging in English, and the person who does it is called a menaker, a traberer or a porger. Other animal parts must also be removed because of their proximity to, contact with, dependence upon, or similarity to chelav, which is that forbidden fat. This includes permitted fats, shuman, that may be confused with chelav. Nikur in the forequarters is slightly easier because the gid hanosha is located in the animal's hindquarters. Additionally, the front half of the animal from rib 12 onward has almost no chelav. Thus, the primary task in nikur of the forequarters is removal of several blood vessels. In this article, except where indicated otherwise, nikur refers to removing the forbidden parts of the hindquarters, not the forequarters. The prohibitions involved are indeed serious. Consuming prohibited fats or blood is more serious than eating pork and incurs the severe punishment of karet, while eating the gid hanosha incurs lashes. A brief treatment of the relevant laws can be found in Shulchan Aruch, Yoredea 64 to 65. Various special kuntrasim that were published, these are, a kuntrist is a pamphlet, that were published over the years deal with this topic in greater detail. Ramoshe Isulish, however, twice states, Yoredea 64:7 and 65:8, that nikur cannot be learned from a text, only through apprenticeship. This is due both to the fact that much of nikur depends upon local custom and to the difficulty of learning the process without actually doing it. It's detailed work requiring anatomic knowledge, surgical skill, patience, and knowledge of tradition. Until relatively recently, the majority of Jewry performed nikur on both forequarters and hindquarters of the animal. Indeed, there's no indication in either Shulchan Aruch or Ramah that the discussion of nikur are anything other than practical. Rav Moshe Sternbach claims that Maharshal, this would be in the 1500s, established a custom that God-fearing people refrained from eating hindquarters. Rabbi Shlomo Mahpud asserts that Rabbi Sternbach's claim is based upon a misreading of Maharshal. Rather, Rabbi Mahpud states, the custom Maharshal established was to refrain from eating the hindquarters until a second menaker inspected what the first one did. Indeed, he writes that Maharshal ate the hindquarters of all animals, save for those of small, delicate calves. Explaining Maharshal in the original supports examining Maharshal in the original supports Rabbi Mahpud's contention. In Yam Shel Shlomo, that is the Maharshal's classic work, the Maharshal records that in the old days in Germany, nikur was not so difficult. However, new stringencies made nikur a far more arduous task, leading to grave mistakes. Overwhelmed by time-consuming stringencies, local menachrim, who could not always keep up with the demand for hindquarters, would sometimes neglect to excise some of the forbidden sections. Thus, writes Maharshal, he therefore does not eat hindquarters until he has a second menaker check the work of the previous one, a practice he says was already instituted by Maharam Mintz. Evidently, Maharshal neither refrained from the consumption of hindquarters, nor did he prohibit others from consuming them. He was simply ascertaining that the nikur was done properly. At some point, the practice of not eating the hindquarters did indeed develop. This was due to several factors, including the difficulty of porging, a lack of trust in the skills of the porgers, and the easy sale of the hindquarters to non-Jews. One of the first to describe this practice, Sephardic Rabbi David ben Solomon ibn Zimra in Egypt in late 1400s, early and 1500s, mentions a local custom of selling the hindquarters to Muslims. This practice is subsequently mentioned by Ashkenazic sources, including Rabbi Menachem Mendel Kruchmal, who makes note of the Shochtim who went to the villages around Nikolsburg and sold the hindquarters to the non-Jews in the villages and brought only the four quarters to the Jewish community. Additionally, Rabbi Yair Chaim Bachrach, the Chavos Yoyer, which would be middle to late 1600s, discusses an individual who supported himself by selling the hindquarters of Jewish meat to non-Jews. In 1614, Rabbi Leon Medina, a well-known Venetian rabbi, was commissioned by an English lord to write a description of Jewish practices for King James I of England. His work, published in 1637 in Italian as Historia degli Riti Hebraici, was the first description of Jewish ritual written by a Jew in the vernacular explicitly for a non-Jewish audience. Rabbi Medina wrote, "Whence it is that in many places in Italy and Germany especially, they do not eat the hindquarters, because the sinew giranasha is in them, and a great deal of fat, which requires much exactness to be taken away clean, and there are but a few that can do it as it should be." The Kabbalist Reb Chaim Vital, the student of the Arizal, wrote that his teacher explicitly told him to partake of hindquarters as long as the nikor was meticulous. Indeed, there are many towns in Europe where nikor was practiced in recent centuries. Rabbi Yechezkel Landau, who's known as the Notable Yehuda, notes that in Prague, nikor was practiced, but he acknowledges that there were cities in which there were no trained menachrim, and thus, for purely practical reasons, it was not practiced there. Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz was a master menacher who was acutely aware of the difficulty of doing nikor correctly. In his work, Crazy Uplacy, he writes that he only eats hindquarters if he himself is the menacher. The Yeshuas Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Meshulam Ornstein, testifies that in all the big cities, such as his community of Lvov, as well as in Brot and Krakow, nikor was performed. Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein, who did we agree that he is or is not your relative, David? The Aruch HaShulchan.
Is.
Okay. So this is David's relative, Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein, who's the Aruch HaShulchan, explains that in his town, Navardik, nikor was under strict rabbinical control, performed not by the butchers, but rather by specifically trained and licensed menachrim. As a further safeguard, the rabbis banned the importation of meat from outside the city. While the Chassam Sofer attests to the fact that in Pressburg, nikor was not performed because of the effort involved, at the same time, nikor was practiced in Lisa and in Prague. Nikor was performed in Melbourne, Australia through the 19th century, although it is not clear when the practice ended. In the early 19th century, nikor was still practiced in Hungary, as evidenced by the publication in 1825 of Beit Yitzchak by Rabbi Yitzchak ben Eliezer. In his work, which was a practical guide to the halachos of nikor, the author states that a menacher should not be overly strict and remove meat that need not be removed halachically, causing undue financial loss. Just as it is prohibited to permit that which is prohibited, it is likewise prohibited to prohibit that which the law permitted. A great detail of information is available about the practice of nikor in London and Jerusalem, places where it was practiced well into the 20th century. In London, nikor was first introduced by the London Board of Shechita in 1827. It seems that housewives were not happy with the appearance of the porged meat. Butchers tried to satisfy their demands by selling unporged hindquarters. In 1865, the tension between the board, the butchers, and the housewives reached such levels that a representative was sent to observe the methods of nikor practice in Leghorn, Italy, and in Paris, in the hopes that nikor was done there in a neater manner. Unfortunately, there were no differences in the methods. The conflict between the housewives, the butchers, and the board continued for decades. That is a cool story. Housewives, butchers, and
But what's the English part of that? It was hard to follow.
So again, nikor is the removal of the forbidden fats and the sciatic nerve. So during that time, apparently after the nikor experts had their way with the meat did not look nice. So the housewives were putting a lot of pressure on the butchers, and the butchers were starting to sell the hindquarters without having the nikur done, which is not acceptable. It's very seriously not acceptable. So they tried to fix the problem by studying how they were doing the nikur in Italy and in Paris, in the hopes that it looked nicer after they were finished, but it didn't. So this was, again, housewives, butchers, and the Board of Shchita in 1827 in London. Eventually, the board licensed only certain butchers to sell hindquarters. This led to other problems. And in 1912 and again 1923, special campaigns were initiated to educate the public about the importance of nikur and to enforce the regulations.
What's the animal that they're talking about?
It's either a cow or a lamb or a goat.
I understand, but that didn't answer David's question about the bird, right?
No, we're done with the birds. The issue with the birds was just for offerings, and since there were sin offering birds, I'm assuming that just like with other sin offerings, that the Kohanim ate them, even though they did nikur, and even though they did malika. Malika is not the same thing as nikur. Malika is
the head,
where you use your thumbnail and you slice the back of the neck of the bird with the thumbnail, and that is how you do it for bird offerings. And if there was a sin offering, I'm assuming that the Kohen ate that bird.
Yeah. That's what we learned in Talmud. We learned about,
Right. However, it would not be, you could not do it with regular birds. Here we're talking about the removal of the sciatic nerve and those fats. Okay. Sometime after 1929, the Beit Din of the board prohibited the sale of hindquarters, though some nikur apparently continued in London until at least 1941. In 1941, Rabbi Yechezkel Abramsky supported Rabbi Binyamin Banish Atlas of Glasgow in rejecting the butcher's request to sell hindquarters. His concerns that it would lead to problems of supervision. The issue again arose in 2000 when the Israeli chain El Gaucho sought to open a kosher branch in London and to serve hindquarters as it does in Jerusalem. The Beit Din of the board eventually turned the store down. So that was one of the selling points of that restaurant, El Gaucho.
Yeah, but what did they do with if they turn that one down? Why didn't they go after the one in Jerusalem?
Yeah, so in Jerusalem, they were comfortable that there were people who knew how to do it. And in Glasgow and in London, they were not. In other words, I guess so in Jerusalem, nikur of the hindquarters was actually instituted by the Ashkenazim. For many years, Sephardim were the majority in Jerusalem, and since the modern community was established by Jews expelled during the Spanish expulsion, Sephardim slaughtered only goats and sheep on which they practiced nikur of the forequarters, but nikur of the hindquarters was not done because of the animal's small size. Following the arrival of the students of the Gra and of the Baal Shem Tov to Palestine in the early 19th century, the Ashkenazic community grew. However, the Turks prohibited the Ashkenazic community from performing its own shechita. Finally, in 1874, when the Ashkenazic community was granted the right to slaughter, it continued to follow the custom of the Sephardim and only performed nikur on the forequarters of goats and sheep. Moreover, the Ashkenazic community adopted the Sephardic customs as regards nikur of the forequarters. This resulted in Yerushalayim Ashkenazim performing nikur of the forequarters different than any other Ashkenazim. In 1876, the Jerusalem Ashkenazim initiated kosher slaughter of cattle. They now introduced nikur achoraim, in other words, the removal of the sciatic nerve and fats from the hindquarters. Based on the practices of the Lithuanian Jews, The following year, Rabbi Yeshua Leib Diskin of Brisk, an expert in Nikor, moved to Jerusalem and together with Rabbi Shmuel Salant established a Vada Shchita to ensure a committee of Shchita to ensure that Shchita and Nikor were performed in the strictest manner. Outside of Eretz Yisrael, the issue of Nikor was raised again during World War II. By the start of World War II, Jews in most parts of Poland no longer practiced Nikor. In March of 1938, the Polish Sejm passed legislation forbidding the sale of kosher slaughtered meat to non-Jews. Reb Chaim Ozer Grudzinski wrote that in a rabbinic meeting held in Warsaw, it was ruled that all Polish Jewish communities, without exceptions, should immediately reintroduce the practice of Nikor Acharoim to avoid significant financial loss to the local Jews of the population. Why is there going to be financial loss? Because you're not going to be able to sell the hindquarters. Up until then, you could sell the hindquarters to non-Jews, but in Poland, they passed a rule that you could not sell kosher meat to non-Jews.
Right.
So,
Can you eat other parts of the animal even if you don't do the hindquarters?
yes, but that means that you're wasting half the animal. And if you can't sell that other half of an animal, that you are taking a tremendous loss on the animal. Nowadays, though, if you, let's say there's shechita in America, the hindquarters of every shechted cow, sheep, or goat in America are sold to Gentiles in order to make it financially feasible to have kosher meat. But when they forbade the selling of the meat to Gentiles, at this point, they can't afford to lose that much of the animal. So therefore, they decided that there is no choice, that people have to learn how to do Nikor properly so that they can have the entire animal as kosher meat.
Rabbi, I wonder if that law was passed for non-Jewish butchers, because people were probably buying, Goyim were probably buying from Jewish butchers, that stuff. And why would you pass that law if it wasn't for economics?
Who knows? Yeah, I don't know. That's good. I don't know. I mean, unless because there are places in modern times that consider shechita to be inhumane. I mean, whatever, animal main. But I don't know if that was a concern in 1938.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know. You're probably right. I don't know. There was no halachic problem in instituting Nikor, stated Reb Chaim Ozer. Even though Nikor was not practiced because of the lack of qualified menachrim, avoiding the consumption of hindquarters was not an actual custom, he said. All of this is to show that there's no existing custom that forbids the eating of the hindquarters if an expert has removed the sciatic nerve and the forbidden fats. There's no existing custom that you can't eat it. So if you went to a place where there are qualified menachrim, people who are qualified to remove the veins and the fats, and you're from a family that hasn't eaten a filet mignon, for 200 years, you would be allowed to eat it. It's not your custom to not eat it. It's just a practical issue of expertise. If you're in a place where people agree that there are experts who know what they're doing, then you would be allowed to eat it today. In Israel, Nikor continued to be practiced. In 1943, Reb Nachum ben Avram Cohen Levin wrote Torah Nikor HaYerushalmi, in which he explained all aspects of practical Nikor of the forequarters and hindquarters as described above. The Ashkenazim in Jerusalem porged the forequarters of animals differently than did other Ashkenazim, as was pointed out, because they had learned to do it like the Sephardim. Newcomers to the land started to question the Nikor practice in Jerusalem, and Rabbi Levin hoped to show that it was in accordance with halacha. and that the differences that exist involve custom only. Clearly, Nikur was alive and well in Jerusalem in 1943. Today, Nikur of the hindquarters is practiced in Israel and is supervised by many of the Sephardic Badatzes as well as the Rabbanut. In addition, the OU supervises Nikur of deer hindquarters in the United States because in deer, only the Gid HaNosha and blood require removal, but not the chalev. The forbidden fats are not forbidden in what we call a chaya. They are only forbidden in a behema. So these fats, even if you find similar ones in a deer, are not forbidden. So when this guy is practicing Nikur, it's much less work, and his specific knowledge of the difference of fats is not required. When we were at the Living Torah Museum, Rabbi Deitch pointed out that bison is chaya. It is not a behema. In other words, bison is treated like deer, which means that the also with bison, they didn't require the same knowledge of removal of hindquarters. I'm not sure why the OU didn't go for bison. Here it just mentions deer. According to Rabbi Dr. Moshe Tendler, in both his father's hometown of Kamenetz and Rabbi Moshe Feinstein hometown of Luban in Belarus, where Ramosha's father-in-law was a shoichet and menaker, Nikur was performed in the early 20th century. People did not stop practicing Nikur because of a ban or custom. Rav Moshe states this clearly. In his opinion, Nikur was not regularly practiced in recent years because butchers didn't want to expand the effort, and there wasn't enough non-Jews to purchase the meat. Rav Moshe states categorically that it is a grave sin to cause a section of the Torah to be forgotten, even if it will not lead to the violation of any prohibitions. So, in other words, Rav Moshe is saying that to just decide that because there aren't a lot of experts in it, we're just going to forbid it and no longer have a need to study it, that is wrong. Every section of Torah that can be applied should be learned, and if it can be applied, it should be applied. Certainly, to forget all the laws of Nikur would fall under this sin. Doing so would also make it impossible to reinstitute the Korban Pesach, which cannot be properly prepared without knowing how to remove the chalev and the Gid HaNosha. Reprinted with permission from Jewish Action. Okay. Was there any long notes there? In note 27, it's interesting. He notes that Nikur of chalev, which is the fat around the four sections of the animal's stomach, was not performed commercially in Jerusalem because of the effort involved. Rather, Sephardic women did the Nikur themselves. It seems that it was an old custom for women to do Nikur. The Beit Yosef records a tradition regarding Nikur that he heard from Nashim Kasherot from Spanish lineage. Nashim Kasherot means kosher women from Spanish lineage. There are also many comments in Maharatz's Seder Hilchos Nikur regarding his asking women about the practice. So apparently, for a long time, it was women that were the experts in Nikur, which is also fascinating. There's some interesting angles here. The angle of that London thing with the housewives and the board of Shechita and the butchers, that is interesting. And also the idea that for in certain areas for many generations, it was the women who did the Nikur, and they were the ones who knew how to do it. In other words, they carried with them that knowledge, which is sort of cool. All righty. Okay.
So did we learn today that Nikor should be done or should be done and practiced so people could get better at doing it rather than not doing it because they don't know how to do it?
Right. It sounds like that was what Ramosha Feinstein
Mhm.
was advocating for. Yeah, that's what it sounded like.
I know that when you go out, you don't usually have filet because being done because of the fact that it usually
Right. I
was
think did I hear that Le Marais, the restaurant
in New York.
Le Marais in New York, had hindquarters? I just want to see here. Le Marais kosher hindquarters. Here it is. Le Marais took the hanger steak off the menu. What gives? They claim it is not worth it for them because sometimes it's too salty and they have to send it back. Hmm. Oh, that's not because of that. But somebody in one of these notes.
Esther just called you. I
Right.
did,
I don't know.
but
Okay.
she called you.
All right. So I don't know if Le Marais has it, but I seem to remember
Talking about
somewhere
Ray and
that
you.
Le Marais.
That's interesting because they would learn, I mean, being a French, just to rival their French chefs, they're able to do it, you know.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
What did Lois say? Sure.
If Le Marais had it to rival the other chef, the French restaurants, it would make sense that they would try to have it.
Because Le Marais was French.
Yeah.
The French court. Right.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Next, he prohibited us from cooking meat with milk, and that is his saying you should not cook a kid in its mother's milk. One who cooks it is lashed even though he didn't eat it, as is explained in several places in the Talmud. So let's say you wanted to work as a cook in a non-kosher restaurant. You're not allowed to even cook meat and milk together. It's forbidden, even though you're not going to eat it. Even though the people that are going to eat it are Gentile and they're allowed to eat it, you're not allowed to cook it. Even just cooking it is a prohibition. All right, we're going to leave this next one.
Rabbi,
yeah.
is cooking non-kosher meat okay? I mean, non-shechted meat okay if you're not going to eat it for other people?
It seems
In
like
general?
it seems like it, as long as they are not Jewish, it seems like it. If they're Jewish, then it's either biblically or rabbinically forbidden, probably, for you to do it. But if they're not Jewish, it seems like it would not be a problem. There is a separate issue, which is a rabbinic one, that you're not supposed to be in a business that relies on selling non-kosher food. So that somehow you'd have to get around that issue. I think there are ways to get around it because you'd have to have a Gentile partner or something, and they would own that part of the business. Yeah. Okay. Now, I apologize, but I cannot meet tomorrow, and I cannot meet on Monday. Tomorrow is something that couldn't be scheduled otherwise, and I apologize for that. And Monday, I'm coming back from a wedding in Minneapolis, and I'm not going to be back in time. So our next class is going to be Tuesday. And again, I apologize for this. All right, so then we'll talk about eating meat and milk. We talked about cooking it so far. All right.
On for tomorrow, though.
Correct. Nachanash is on tomorrow, and the Rambam and the Tuesday night class is on tonight.
And the Thursday morning.
And the Thursday morning is still on. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, thank you,
Okay.
Rabbi.
All right. Bye-bye.
Have a good one.
You too.